Today we talk about organic carbon that was found on Mars and what does this actually mean. In the summer of 2024, a rover, NASA's rover, rolled along an ancient dry riverbed on Mars, stopped next to a rock and then took a selfie. Turns out the rock sitting next to the rover was a rock nicknamed Cheyava Falls. Is probably one of the most fascinating things NASA has ever announced in years. And a few weeks ago, a new study came out that adds another layer to the story and makes it even more complicated. The rover, which is by the way called Perseverance, landed inside a crater called Jezero. Now, about 3.5 billion years ago, when Mars was a completely different world with a thicker atmosphere and liquid water on surface, Jezero was a lake. A river actually flowed into it, and when the water disappeared, what was left behind was mud that eventually hardened into a rock. Mud happens to be one of the best materials there is because it seals around whatever was inside it before the material has a chance to break down. Probably if microbial life ever existed on Mars, there's a decent chance to find it there. Perseverance dropped down from the delta into a channel that fed it, which is a valley named, I hope I'm saying it correctly, Neretiva Vallis, roughly 400 meters wide, and then found a stretch of rock there called Bright Angel. These rocks are noticeably lighter than everything around them. The rover, just so you know, doesn't have a biology lab on its back, so what it has is this robotic arm and at the end of the arm, two key instruments. One is called Pixel, which maps the chemical makeup of a rock using X-rays, and then essentially produce this map of which element sits where. The other instrument is called Sherlock, which is an instrument that hunts for organic molecules, meaning carbon-based molecules, using a laser and this ultraviolet light. Sherlock can't tell you whether something came from life. It can only tell you there's carbon here and it's arranged in a certain way. The team pointed both instruments at Cheyava Falls and got this crazy result. First, this rock is threaded with white veins of calcium sulfate. Between those veins are reddish bands colored by hematite, one of the minerals responsible for Mars' famous rust color. And then there was another crazy thing on those reddish bands, which was dozens of small off-white splotches, each about 1 millimeter across, and each of them was ringed by a thin halo of dark material. And the team called it leopard spots. Don't worry, I'll explain everything and you don't have to understand any of this yet. So on Earth, when you see a similar pattern in sedimentary rock, it's often a result of chemical reactions involving hematite, reactions that turn rock from red to white. Those same reactions can release iron and phosphate, which can produce that dark halo around the spot. And under the right conditions on Earth here, those exact reactions can serve as an energy source for microbes. In other words, the chemistry that produced the leopard spots on Earth is sometimes directly tied to bacteria feeding on it. But hold your horses, that doesn't mean that the spots on Mars were made by life. It just means that they resemble a phenomenon that here on Earth is linked to life. But this story actually happens to be deeper than this part. So beyond the leopard spots, the team also found much smaller features they nicknamed poppy seeds, these tiny black specks also associated with organic material. When they measured the exact chemical composition of these spots and seeds, they found them enriched in iron, phosphorus, and zinc compared to the surrounding mudstone. The leading interpretation right now is that these are minerals called vivianites. I'm not going to go too deep into explaining these minerals, you just need to know that both of those minerals here on Earth often form through processes tied to microbial activity. When bacteria essentially breathe iron or sulfur to survive in environments without oxygen. How mind-blowing is that? Think of the scientists when they first understood what they are seeing. Now I know that this sounds like a final clear proof that there is, or there was at least, life on Mars. But sounds like and is are two different things. The bright angel rock, the one containing this organic carbon, turns out to be the most oxidized rocks found anywhere in Jezero so far. That means they're chemically rich in bound oxygen, and that's a little strange because oxygen and organic carbon usually don't like sharing the same place. Oxygen tends to break organic matter down, not preserve it. So in exactly the rocks where you'd expect to find the least organic material, they found the most. One possible explanation is that something about the environment where these rocks were formed roughly 3.5 billion years ago allowed organic matter to accumulate anyway, despite the oxidizing conditions. And at other sites in Jezero, like nearby formation called Masonic Temple, almost no organic material shows up at all. The difference, according to the researchers, likely comes down to how fast the rocks formed.
On August 20th, 1975, the first Viking spaceship was launched.
In the mid-70s, two spacecraft called Viking landed on Mars and ran biology experiments directly on the soil. One of those experiments, nicknamed the labeled release experiment, produced a genuinely strange result. When they added a compound with tagged carbon to the soil, gas came out, exactly the way it would if microbes were eating the compound. But other experiments on that same soil found no organic material at all, which directly contradicted the biological report. The debate for what actually happened there has run for nearly 50 years and still isn't finally settled. So you see, one fascinating result, however exciting, is not proof. Every single signal described here on its own could form without any connection to life, actually. Organic carbon can arrive from, for example, meteorites or cosmic dust that fall onto Mars regularly, completely independent of any biological process, for instance. And speaking of organic matter arriving from space, this isn't unique to Mars. On Earth too, scientists occasionally find meteorites containing complex organic molecules, including amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. It happens. A meteorite that just fell in New York, for example, not long ago, was analyzed in a lab and found to contain amino acids. And this doesn't necessarily mean that this meteorite contained life. It just means that the universe is full of complex organic chemistry that forms with no connection to biology whatsoever and scatters between planets without much effort. So you see, if organic material can simply land on a planet's surface out of meteorites and cosmic dust, then the mere presence of organic carbon on Mars by itself doesn't tell you very much. The real question is always about context, where the carbon sits and how it's arranged and which mineral keeps it company. This brings me to the new study I just read that just came out recently, which adds an important piece of the story. So because NASA has this thing where they operate under an open science policy, they upload all raw geological data, images, and measurements captured by the Mars rovers to a free public archive. So a team from the Planetary Science Institute in Arizona went back to the same 2024 data and re-examined it in much greater depth. They examined 4 measurement targets across 3 separate rocks at Bright Angel. And what's super interesting in this study is that this carbon is located in different places in the same rock, meaning these carbon spots are from different times. One part of the carbon turns up mixed into the rock's original sediment, the material that was there when the mud first settled out of the river, meaning it was there when Mars still had water. And the other part turns up in later minerals that formed after fluids moved through the already hardened rock. Now we have a much more detailed picture of where the carbon sits and roughly when it likely arrived. But the biggest question, where it originated in the first place, remains wide open. And now one more thing, I want to pull us to a completely different part of Mars, years before Perseverance even landed. Another rover, Curiosity, found organic material in a different crater called Gale, more than 3,500 kilometers from Jezero. You see where I'm going with this? This is a huge argument for life on Mars, because if organic material is found spread around Mars and not confined to one small spot, it changes the whole picture. This stops being this single isolated anomaly. These organic spots may have been scattered across enormous areas, across different time periods, in different environments. But scientists are still not sure. At the end of the day, Perseverance has already done everything it can. To finally answer whether this carbon is biological or not, you need the actual sample, physically brought back into Earth. And this is what Perseverance is doing right now. It carries a drilling system that extracts small rock cores a few centimeters long and seals them inside completely airtight tubes. The sample taken from Cheyava Falls is called Sapphire Canyon, and it's already there, sealed inside one of these tubes, one of Perseverance's tubes. The problem is that all of those samples are currently just sitting there on Mars, and the original plan called for a separate mission, a partnership between NASA and the European Space Agency, to land on Mars, collect those tubes and launch them back towards Earth. That means building a small rocket that lands on Mars, stays there in Mars's crazy temperature swings, and then launches itself back, grabs the sample tubes either from mid-air or from the ground, and heads back to Earth. And that sounds like something Tom Cruise would do in Mission Impossible. It's too complex, it's too expensive, and right now nobody wants to do it. We're left here to deal with the agonizing truth that the answer we're looking for all this time is already sitting there on Mars, packaged and ready. And I gotta tell you, any knowledge gained from these samples is worth pursuing either way. If lab analysis eventually shows these molecules formed through non-biological processes, that's still a massive finding. It would teach us an enormous amount about how the building blocks of life can form throughout the universe. But if it turns out these molecules really were produced by something alive, then we're talking about one of the defining moments in the history of science. You know, aliens. And this also means, beyond the fact that aliens might exist, that life wasn't a rare one-time accident that happened only here. It would tell us that given the right conditions, life probably finds a way to get started again and again wherever it gets the chance.